the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch. I'm a co-host along with Matt Bates, Drew Johnson, Aaron Heim, Chris Tilling, and Amy Brown Hughes. And we are so glad you've tuned in today. I want to say at the beginning here a special thanks from the OnScript co-hosting team to Ed Hatkey for producing the show, to Rebecca Terhune for help with marketing and media, and to James Steinbach for help with the website and all the back-end stuff. So we have a fantastic team, and we couldn't do it without you, so thanks so much. And to those of you who listen and support the show either by giving us a rating on iTunes or wherever you're listening, or support us financially, we're extremely grateful to you as well. You can help us out if you would like to spread the word about OnScript through various means. For instance, if any of you are good with computer programming and have access to an animal shelter or to a dog breeder or something like that, where they implant the microchips on dogs to keep track of them and are able to change the names of the dogs to onscript.study. That's one way that as people lose their pets, and they'll lose their pets, they can, and they scan for their dog. You know, if someone finds a dog, they'll scan it and they'll see onscript.study. And they should have a dog collar on, so it should still have the name on it, so that's not lost. So that's just one way you can help out, get the word out through means that are less conventional, and that's the way we try to do things at OnScript. We have a very special episode this time. This was a recording of a live socially distanced event that we had at Nashotah House Theological Seminary this summer, and we want to say a special thanks to Nashotah for hosting the event. And although it was not a normal summer event, we still were able to gather in an open-air tent environment, and a few of us were able to come together. So that was very nice, and special thanks to Jeannine Brown for making the trip out to Nashotah from Minnesota to join us for that. So hope you enjoy this episode.
Hey folks, good evening. I asked Dr. Lynch, who will be the master of ceremonies tonight for the podcast recording, if I could have the honor of introducing our guest, Dr. Jeannine Brown. And the reason I wanted to do the introduction tonight is because Jeannine Brown and I go back 40 years, which is to say we met as undergraduates in 1980. And so I am a year older, if that helps at all. Does that help, Jeannine?
I'll take that.
Yeah. Okay. And we went to college together. We were both involved as student leaders in the same InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. We were in the same music department. And in fact, Jeannine was my piano accompanist through a lot of that time. And so anyway, I would describe my life as 40 years of trying to catch up with Jeannine Brown. And I got the same degree. I got a job in the same field. She had a grandson in December. I had a grandson 2 weeks later. And I'm just 10 books behind. Other than that, it's going pretty well. I have a lot of stories about Jeannine. I won't tell them because we have other things to do tonight. I will tell you this one. Jeannine had something of a reputation for being frugal. And one evidence of her frugality was when she started her Master's of Divinity at seminary, she was like, I don't need to pay anybody to teach me Greek. So she taught herself. And before she finished her MDiv, she was teaching Greek for the seminary, which gives you a little idea of the intelligence and discipline and the kind of person that we're talking about here. And she met her husband in her Greek class. So think about that, dating your Greek teacher. All right. So anyway, that's the kind of person that's here. Yeah. Stop. Okay. Nashotah House folks will know Jeannine Brown from a couple of things. One of them is if you're in our hybrid distance or residential program, you have read her book or will, Scripture as Communication, in our biblical interpretation class, which came out in 2007, and we've been using it for over 10 years ever since. It's a really fine book. Jeannine's books are many. She has actually 2 commentaries on Matthew, one in the Teach the Text and one in the Two Horizons series. She's slated for commentaries on Philippians in the Tyndale commentary series, if you know that one, and a commentary on 1 Peter in the New International Commentary on the New Testament. The other way that Nashotah House students might know Dr. Brown is through the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospel, 2nd edition, for which she was one of the 3 editors, which is a big deal. Anyway, a really fine scholar, wonderful person, a very young grandmother. And she's here tonight to talk to Matt Lynch about her new book, The Gospels as Stories, which I have on my desk. I've read the introduction. It's really a great introduction. I have a long way to go. But anyway, it looks like a fantastic book. It is a culmination of Jeannine's work in the Gospels, and especially narrative approaches to the Gospels. So she's just the right person to write that kind of a book. And I'm going to turn it over to Matt Lynch and OnScript for taking it from here. Thank you for being here, Jeannine.
So glad to be with y'all.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to a live, our 4th annual live recording of the OnScript podcast at Nashotah House Theological Seminary. And I want to announce here at the beginning that we have a new tagline for OnScript, coined by our very own Rebecca Terhune. And OnScript is here, keeping you off Netflix 1 episode at a time. So thanks, Rebecca, for that tagline. So I just want to welcome all OnScript superfans to a socially distanced live event here. It's a pleasure to be back here. It's always fun to be able to get together in person with people who listen to OnScript and some who don't for whatever reason. And thanks so much to Nashotah for your willingness to host this event, which is always fun, and especially to Dr. Jeannine Brown for coming this evening. Even though this isn't quite our normal format, being so spread apart here, it is nice to be together. So I'm going to go over some intro welcome stuff again. This will touch on some of the points that Gar mentioned, but we're pleased to welcome Dr. Brown here. Dr. Brown is professor of New Testament at Bethel Seminary, and Jeannine is the author of Scripture as Communication, Becoming Whole and Holy, and 2 commentaries on Matthew in the Teach the Text series, and in the New Horizon, Two Horizons series. She's also co-edited the 2nd edition of Jesus and the Gospels. She's a co-author of Relational Integration of Psychology and Christian Theology. How about that? And the book under discussion today, The Gospels as Stories, a Narrative Approach to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which was just released last month, I think. So, Jeannine, welcome to OnScript.
So good to be here. Thank you.
Is this your first time at Nashotah House?
It is. We got here quite well with Google Maps, and it's just beautiful. My daughter and I, Libby is here with me, and we took a walk this afternoon. Beautiful, beautiful place.
Yeah, I think the trees here are pretty amazing.
Absolutely.
So and the whole campus is beautiful. Now, just to start out, you've been friends with Gar for quite a while now, the president and provost of Nashotah. Now, would you describe that friendship as challenging or taxing?
A, challenging. B, taxing. C, delightful. D, all of the above. It's been a wonderful, really 40 years. Is that really true? And Dawn? Wow.
Well, that's good to hear. It's not always easy being friends with people, but it's if you stick with it long term, sometimes it begins to pay off after a while. So I do hope that for you.
Those long-term benefits, I'll look for those in the future.
Yeah. So now you, it'd be interesting to hear how you got into the study of the Bible. What was your pathway into biblical studies? Were there any kind of key moments that defined your decision to study the Bible formally, academically? Absolutely.
So I'll first give the disclaimer. I grew up in a church context, lovely Christian context, but women could do only 3 things. I knew this intuitively. I don't think anybody ever said, here are the 3 things you can do. You can be a Sunday school teacher, a choir director, or a missionary. My daughter can tell you I like to stay home. The mission kind of thing wasn't exactly I don't have an adventurous spirit that way. I have directed a choir in a church, little 4th and 5th graders, one of the worst experiences of my entire life.
Sort of ticking that box.
So at 7th grade, I told my Sunday school class, when the teacher said, "What would you like to be when you grow up?" I said, "A Sunday school teacher." And I was laughed out of the room, not literally, but of course metaphorically. And but I hung in there and hung on to that. And when I was in 10th grade, I taught a Bible study for 4th and 5th graders at camp. I was the camp counselor. And I remember poring over this handout on 1 John. It was purple. And I remember that I can see the questions in my mind's eye. And I had written all the way down in those little blanks for questions and all the way up the side and around the side. On the back, I had Strong's Concordance out. I didn't know what to do with Greek words, but I was sure that there was something there for me. So,
pulling out the heavyweights.
Yeah, and so this was 10th grade. So when people say, how did you experience God's call? I say, well, God kind of pushed me from behind into all of this. And part of it was that deep love for Scripture and for studying it and when the 4th and 5th graders ran out of that chapel, there was about 10 of them, and they ran out for free time, and I think they were really glad to get out of my class. I remember sitting there in this glow. I was just basking in this place of, I loved doing that. So I think for me, it was a slow recognition over time. InterVarsity Christian Fellowship helped me to hone some teaching skills, and I had to kind of really work through some of the issues of women in teaching and ministry in that context, and went off to seminary, and I guess the rest is history.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, you're coming to us today from Minneapolis, and I was just curious if you could talk about your experience recently, church responses to, kind of in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. What would have been the conversations on the ground there?
Absolutely. I speak from a place of privilege on this topic. We live in St. Paul, right across the river from Minneapolis, so we heard the helicopters overhead. We saw some burnt-out buildings on our side of the river. My daughter lives in Minneapolis, so we've kind of seen the aftermath, the physical aftermath. I think for the things that need to change, I really want to hear from communities of color, as I'm sure many of us do. And I did some checking in with some of our church leaders, some of our alum who are leading churches in the cities. And I'm really encouraged by what they're doing in the midst of this. I know the communities of color broadly are acting to enact change. One of our alum is a pastor of Sanctuary Covenant Church, and they're doing peace barbecues where they bring people together, socially distant kind of way, and distribute food in their neck of the woods, which is North Minneapolis area. One of my favorite classes out there this summer online through Mill City Church is an introduction to whiteness class. So I see churches and leaders kind of pressing into figuring out how do we respond in ways that are long-term, that are systemic, and that recognize the deep pain that has been part of communities of color, not just in Minneapolis, but of course across our nation. So I don't at all pretend to be an expert on these issues, but I have been encouraged by some of the long-term looking and looking at self as well as looking at systems.
Yeah, good. Now, you're an accomplished biblical scholar, but you also have a keen interest in collaborative work with colleagues in systematic theology, psychology, social sciences. You seem to have a real interdisciplinary capacity. So what are some of the conversations happening in those areas right now that we might not be familiar with? What does that collaboration look like, and what have you been part of?
My interest in integration, I think, really was guided and enlivened in the early 2000s at Bethel Seminary. There was a strong push by our provost to do interdisciplinary conversation, and none of us knew what that meant or looked like exactly, especially in a very siloed academy, and seminaries had that same kind of siloing of various disciplines. But he gave us space to do that. And I was actually, one of my early jobs at Bethel in terms of faculty role was faculty development chair. And I thought, these sound like really fun conversations, so we're just going to hold a lot of them. And we figured out some things along the way about how to do that kind of conversation, where we actually sit face to face. I don't try to learn your field or borrow from your field until I've just sat with you for a while and heard what you have to say. One of the things we learned was that it's helpful to share from strengths. So if I'm doing my work, in the Gospels, and I just share about something I'm excited about, it's very likely somebody in a field of maybe psychology, we had a marriage and family, we do still have a marriage and family therapy program, or theology might say, hey, that sounds like a place where we could have some interesting conversation. So learning to share from a place of strength and then receive that, rather than kind of maybe the more intuitive way in our field has been to say, I'm going to just go learn a little bit more about that. And if I can do some psychology and bring it into my biblical studies, and that's not a bad thing to do, but we found that sometimes you could end up doing a bit of cherry picking. In other words, if I'm doing psychology in my biblical studies and the psychologists in the room are going like, shuddering, then you've gone past, you've transgressed a line. And how do you know if you've transgressed a line? You don't, unless you're an expert in the field. So we just found that checking our work with one another, if we're going to do that kind of work. I had a psychologist who came to me, brilliant man, with whom I wrote the book Psychology and Christian Theology, Relational Integration of, Steve Sandage. He came to my door one day and said, would you look at this work on forgiveness from Matthew 18? I'm like, sure. And the humility of coming to someone and saying, will you look at my work, when he was publishing far more than I was at that point. And he's been a wonderful colleague to work with, because he's not territorial. He really wants to pursue knowledge. And some of the interesting conversations, one of the things he works on regularly are psychology of the virtues. So he has a humility project right now. There's a lot of funding now for thinking about various virtues. So humility, I threw an email to him the other day on Philippians and anxiety. Paul says, don't be anxious. And yet in chapter 2, at the very end of the chapter, he expresses lovely relational anxiety about Epaphroditus, Philippian church, himself, and this lovely... So I floated the language of relational anxiety to Steve to see what he would say, and he gave me a whole chapter in a book to read, right? So I have some work to do, but there's this kind of amazing synergy and trust when you get to know somebody, and he knows he can check with me, and we know we can do common projects. And that's just been delightful, because I'm no psychologist, and you don't want me for a therapist. So, to collaborate with somebody who does those things so well, he's just one example.
So what would you say is the role of, a lot of people here and a lot of our listeners are interested in keeping up with the field of biblical studies, but their primary interests are in the church. And so what would you say is the role of academic study of the Bible for the church?
And my experience in that conversation, it's been, on one hand, I've had great relationships with pastors and teachers, and they'll bring me in to teach a class in their church, and I enjoy being a part of their congregation or conversations. And on the other hand, there's this ongoing tension between academy and church that's just been documented, and people have felt in the sense of, do you have to go get a PhD to really be able to read the Bible? And on the other hand, are we really doing that in the church? Sort of academics looking in with a microscope or with binoculars and saying, should we really be doing that? I think one of the really important skills that we can bring to this conversation is the skill of listening well, and also acknowledging strengths. I mean, I am just so impressed by the pastors and teachers and leaders in the church who are doing work on the ground that I could never do, that I'm not gifted to do. And so hearing what not just their questions for me, but their input to me, their strengths, the way they see ministry. And I think for those in the academy to share with confidence what they know, and not hide it under a bushel, to use a Matthean phrase. So just, I mean, this sense of being more honest we both have something to share with one another. And I'd love to see that conversation be really even more productive than I think it's becoming more productive as I see the last, 30 years or so of scholarship.
Sure. So just turning to your book, The Gospels as Stories, you say near the beginning of your book that humans interpret and make sense of reality through stories. And this seems like the kind of thing that's often said, but not necessarily understood. So you've explored that dynamic from the perspective of not only literary and biblical studies, but theology and sociology. So how exactly does it work that we make sense of reality through stories? What does that mean? According to narrative psychologists and others, and we're wired for story, meaning that we take what could be just understood as random sequences in our life and we make meaning out of them. We string them together with some sort of story arc. We don't all do that in every moment, but there is a sense of telling our life story, the fact that we can say that. Or a doctor will take a family history. Those are representations of, again, what could be seen as just different events and saying, no, there's a continuity here. What I think is interesting from narrative, so then you have something called narrative psychology, you have something called narrative theology, you have narrative criticism or narrative analysis, which I press into in the book and kind of explore with my readers. So it seems like all sorts of fields are really interested in this topic. It's kind of the narrative turn in the postmodernist day. One thing that narrative psychologists say is that there's strength to kind of telling your story in a coherent but yet complex way, allowing for the complexity and the tensions of life. There's something that can be unhelpful to you, harmful, in fact, if you tell your story too coherently. Or, I mean, you can think, of course, telling your story in a really disintegrative way, kind of nothing connecting. You can hear how that could be really harmful toward understanding even meaning and purpose. But two coherent narratives, Adler, I think, talks about, kind of intriguing for thinking about how we look at Scripture. Do we allow for the tensions and the complexities of narrative to really come out? Or do we have a quick answer to tie it all up in a bow in the end? Do the narrative writers in the Bible really do that? Or do they leave that complexity kind of there in terms of who people are and what God is doing? So I find narrative across those different disciplines really helpful for thinking about what we're seeing in the Gospels. Yeah, and it strikes me too, in our Old Testament class this week, we were talking about the narrative structure of the Bible, but also how, right at the beginning, it starts out with two creation stories. So you have, right from the get-go, a complex way of telling a story that almost immediately resists a single narrative or one kind of coherent story that doesn't allow for kind of two perspectives right off the bat. And of course, in the Gospels, you have the same thing. Yeah, if a simplistic way of understanding story, it seems is both harmful for us as people and also potentially for our reading. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned narrative criticism or narrative analysis, which is what you're talking about for a great deal of your book. What are some examples of how narrative criticism has opened up the Gospels for you? Reading the story from beginning to end, really truly doing that. Even if I come to a middle part of the story saying what has come before. I realize we can't always read 28 chapters of Matthew in one sitting if we want to understand a part of Matthew. Yet that question of how does this all hang together has been such a helpful lens for me. One way it helped. One thing about story is that stories, those who write stories are communicating often very implicitly what's going on, not explicitly. So
narrative theology is not so much about capturing one-liners from the Gospels. There are some great one-liners, so I mean, I'm not dissing one-liners, but if we only thought of theology sort of propositionally, and then we got to the Gospels, we'd lose things or we'd miss things like Matthew's wisdom Christology. Matthew never says Jesus is wisdom. And yet in chapter 11, he implies very clearly, I think, that Jesus is wisdom. In chapter 11, verse 2 and 19, there's a nice little inclusio, or bookend, that talks about the deeds of the Messiah. John the Baptist heard about the deeds of the Messiah. And then in 19, wisdom is vindicated by her deeds, erga in both cases. So Jesus' deeds and wisdom deeds seem to be the same thing for Matthew in that section of text. And then at the end of chapter 11, Jesus calls out. Matthew has Jesus calling out, come to me, all you who are weary, burdened down, I will give you rest. This sounds like wisdom from Proverbs 9, from the Book of Wisdom in the Jewish tradition. So we have Jesus taking on the voice of the persona of wisdom to say, come, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. This is all language kind of dripping with that wisdom resonance from the Old Testament and from Jewish literature. So we'd miss that if we only thought of narrative as the giver of great one-liners.
Yeah. Now, with having, I guess one of the key emphases of a narrative approach to the Gospels is allowing each Gospel its own voice. And when you move from that approach to theology, now the Jesus we worship is one Jesus. So what's the relationship between the maintaining those four angles and wanting to also, in some sense, theologically, it's hard to resist creating a composite, the drive to create a composite. So how do you see those two in relation?
Well, we trust we are in relationship with a single Jesus, not four Jesuses, I think you're trying to say. This is not a question to ask a Matthean scholar, though, because I talk about the Matthean Jesus, right? So in my book with Kyle Roberts, the Matthew commentary, in the beginning, as we kind of talk about our method a little bit and how we differed in our methods, theologian, biblical scholar, I talk about a situation in class. We were teaching a course called Matthew for Theology to kind of get ourselves started writing this thing. And one of the students said, but Jesus does this. And I said, I didn't even breathe. I just said, not in Matthew, he doesn't. I mean, it sounded like a scolding parent. That's just really scary. But it was it was really important that we understand we are studying Matthew for theology.
Oh, no, Matthew doesn't.
No, Matthew doesn't do that. So I'm a really bad person to ask about this because I still am working this out in my own spiritual formation. So I'll just say I do have a spiritual director, but I need help with this myself because I so appreciate the Johannine portrait. And so maybe I'm a little bit disintegrated in that I go to the portrait that Jesus for me today, I'm really resonating with the Johannine Jesus. I don't know.
Maybe
I'm not quite sure I have a great answer.
4-day regimen where you
there
rotate
you go.
through
there
them.
You go, yeah. No, I mean, I think in my own experience, Jesus is more than and beyond all of those four. But I try to discipline myself to listen to those portraits to understand my relationship with Christ. So, but it's like I'm not the person to ask. Any person in this room will give a better answer for how to think coherently about Jesus than I can do at this point.
Yeah, so I'm sure you get this question a lot. The part of the point of understanding narrative is that it's selective. The writer chooses to include or exclude certain things. So, given the Gospels and Jesus' own emphasis on children, why do you think we don't get a lot of his early life to kind of even just sort of pave the way for his ministry or something?
Narrative criticism is also very interested in what are these things we read, what are the Gospels in terms of the genre, and Richard Burridge's work is really important to me and to so many others, emphasizing that they fit really quite well, not fully, of course, the category of Greco-Roman bioi, or biographies. And in the first century world, or in that time, those biographies, those bioi, are not really interested in the early life of their, whether it's like a general or a philosopher, or, in this case, Jesus. But we have a lot of biographies out there, and they just don't spend much time on their early years. They get pretty quickly into the public ministry, public debut, and spend time there. And then the death of the figure gets quite a bit of time as well. So they do fit really nicely in those sort of formalistic ways. The Greco-Roman category. It is important, and I think Wright and N.T. Wright and others mention this, that the Jewish cast to the Gospels needs to be reckoned with as well. We just don't read them just as Greek texts. We hear that Jewish influence, especially in the use of the Old Testament. But we wouldn't expect to if we were thinking in the genre of the first century world. But it is then interesting to say, so what does Matthew do and what does Luke do? Who the two who give us the infancy narratives, and how are they different narratively? John the Baptist, Jesus alternating in the beginning of Luke, way to show a comparison, right? John, really good guy. Jesus, like far above, right? I mean, the comparison is the point. He doesn't say John, really good guy, but you know what I mean. There's this comparison back and forth. In Matthew, the infancy narrative, first of all, is to say Joseph adopts Jesus, because that whole genealogy is not going to help us if Joseph doesn't adopt him to get to it. And then in chapter 2, Jesus is vulnerable. Read chapter 2. Jesus has no active. There are no verbs in the active voice attached to Jesus. He's not the subject of any of them. He is at the mercy of all that's going on, and King Herod's out to get him. So there's this great conflict narrative, and God protects through dreams, through the star, through magi, just the angel that speaks, and then Joseph, and it's a powerful story of God's protection of this one. Of his son, and so the Israelite Christology there, as well as the protection theme, is powerful. So narratively, you can hear those themes come up even in that little bit of background we get.
So in the Greco-Roman biographies, was the infancy part of those biographies, or was that even glossed over and just...
It's just very little on their early life prior to when when a general becomes a general.
So that's a point of difference then, is the time that Matthew and Luke spend on.
Yeah, and they don't give much time though to it. I mean, so there can be some attention to preparation. We see that, but yeah, it fits sort of the general sense of how much weight to those various areas. Yeah.
You talk about different literary techniques in the book, which you helpfully define and discuss. I won't go through all those here, like foreshadowing and flashback and that sort of thing. You had a really good example on page 60 of women being written into the Gospels, or not into the Gospels, into the disciples through flashback, or analepsis is the, I guess, literary technical term. So a bit of jargon there, but I was just wondering if you could give us a flavor for how that process works. I thought that was a really interesting example.
Yeah, and I stole that from Robert Karras. He has a great article on it, so I just want to not claim that as my own. So these narrative flashbacks, or that kind of thing, really are about sequencing in the gospel. And so the first chapter after the introduction is on the plotting of the Gospels, how narrative writers plot their Gospels, how they sequence it, what they do, how they arrange. And I think this is such a fascinating area, especially because I grew up in a context where I just had to assume that the Gospels were strictly and precisely chronological. And so I couldn't really ask the question of plotting, because that sounds like the narrative writer, the Gospel writer, actually does something with it. Well, a lovely side note about Greco-Roman bioi is that they also are not always interested in chronology. Theme can trump chronology in their work. So if they want to emphasize a theme, they can arrange things slightly differently. We think, well, that's not a biography. Well, not a modern one, but it is an ancient one. So you can look at that plotting of a gospel, and I then, in the third chapter, take on Luke and say, let's look at Luke's plot line and what he does with it. There are 3 passion predictions, or predictions of Jesus' suffering and death in Luke, primary ones, in the travel narrative, chapters 9 through 19. And the first two are to the disciples. It says just sort of generically disciples. The last one is to the 12. So we hear quite specifically the 12 male disciples. And if we're used to just reading the disciples as men, we won't be thinking there were women there, except that when Luke gets to chapter 24, the angels remind the women who are at the tomb, remember how he told you in Galilee. And then we have pretty much a quotation from either the second or the third, or maybe a combination of those last two passion predictions. And it says, then they remembered his words. So we'll have to stop and say, they were there. And this makes sense of Matthew, sorry. Luke 8,
That's
1
not
through 3.
Matthew.
No, that's not Matthew. In Luke 8, we hear about the 12 and some women who also were accompanying Jesus. Mary Magdalene and Joanna is mentioned there, who were supporting them out of their means. But they were also with him. That language is used of both groups, which is discipleship language. So we won't be surprised if, as Richard Bauckham argues in chapter 10, when the 72 or the 70 go out, they go out in pairs, and they could be both men and women. That's very possible, given what we see in chapter 8 and elsewhere. So then, at the end of the story, it might be that Luke now wants us to pay attention to the fact that women were also in that disciple group.
Yeah. So we're going to switch gears for a moment here and do a speed round. So this is where I ask you questions, and you have to give off the cuff responses. So,
I can do off the cuff.
And I've organized this according to categories. I've never done this before, so I'm trying something completely new. So the first one is the Minnesota quiz.
No, not a quiz. You didn't say quiz. You said speed round.
Yeah. Okay. It's but I think we'll see how Minnesotan you are.
I like to give quizzes.
Okay, so here's a question: how many lakes are there in Minnesota?
10,000 or so.
Yeah, but it could be a little more precise.
12,000 and something.
That's not bad. Okay, 11,842.
Yeah, 12,000 and something.
Yeah. Okay, second one. Long before it aired on Comedy Central and Sci-Fi Channel, this cult TV show premiered on Minneapolis public access television in the late 1980s. Do you know what that show is?
No idea.
Mystery Science Theater 3000. Anyone a fan out there? Okay, all right.
Boring.
Okay.
I'm just kidding. Sorry.
Okay, Minnesota question number 3. This famous canned food is manufactured in Minnesota. You got it.
Yeah.
Did you look at my question?
No.
Okay.
I've driven down that way before.
Yeah.
I drive by the Spam plant.
Actually, I think I tried to go to the museum one time and it was closed.
That's a sad thing.
Yeah. Okay, so the second category is called Rate That Book. So I've done this for a couple times now, and so I use the random word generator on Google. You can just use random word; it pulls up any word. The word was on, O-N. So then I take that, plug it into Amazon.com under books, and the first book that comes up, I'd like you to give it a rating out of 5 stars. So the book that came up, and I want you to say how many stars do you give it and why. So the book is HRH, which I assume means Her Royal Highness. Subtitle, So Many Thoughts on Royal Style. And I'll just read you the little blurb from it. Veteran style journalist Elizabeth Holmes expands her popular Instagram series, So Many Thoughts, into a nuanced look at the fashion and branding of the foremost influential members of the British royal family. Queen Elizabeth II, Diana, Princess of Wales, Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, and Meghan. How many stars do you give it and why?
1. I would have expected to hear Kate Middleton in there somewhere.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for that sober rating. Second one, I did another random search. I think the word. What was the word that came up? I think it was agenda. That was it. So the title is Dark Agenda. Subtitle, The War to Destroy Christian America. How many stars do you give it?
I have not read it. I just want to make that very clear.
That doesn't mean you can't give it a rating.
I know. So what was the description? You didn't give me a description.
No, I didn't have the description for that.
Well, I think I can pass if there's no description.
Okay, that's fair. What do you think is the most significant book in biblical studies in the last 50 years?
Oh, my goodness. Oh, man. Oh. Okay. My favorite Matthew book is R.T. France's Matthew and then ICNT commentary series. I love that thing, and it's on my bedside sometimes when I'm reading, and best commentary out there.
Excellent. Well,
2008,
that's a good recommendation. By the way, this question about the best book in biblical studies in the last 50 years causes more anxiety than any question I ever asked.
I just went a whole different direction. I just thought I'm just going to ignore the question. It's like what Jesus does in Matthew 18. When the disciples say, "Who is the greatest?" and he says, "Unless you become like a child, you will not even enter the kingdom of heaven." He didn't answer the question.
Yeah,
This
that's true.
is a way to show the question wasn't good in the first place.
Right, yeah. Question evasion.
That's what I just did.
What book has had the greatest significance on you?
Any book.
Yeah, not the Bible.
Not the Bible.
Yeah.
Pride and Prejudice.
Okay.
My daughter, Elizabeth Austen Brown, sits next to me, too. On my third date with my husband, Tim, we both figured out at the same time as we were talking that we loved Jane Austen. He had signed up for a Hemingway class, but he signed up too late. And so he had to take the next class down the pike, and it was Austen. And he walked into the room, and there were 48 women and 2 men, and he thought, this is great. So the fact that we both fell in love kind of with Jane Austen and then over Jane Austen was significant.
That's really meaningful. Good. Do you have a favorite novel of Jane Austen's then?
So, Pride and Prejudice, though I like all 7, and I've really come to like Lady Susan, which is underrated. It's an epistolary novel. It's just very fascinating to think about that genre.
Okay, so the next category is in the speed round is called
There's more of the speed run. This is not very speedy. I'm just going to comment.
Sometimes it slows down. It's called Which is in the Bible?
Oh no! This one will make me more nervous.
Yeah, and you have to tell me if it's in the Bible. So you get I'll read. You've got A, B, and C are the choices here. Okay. Okay. A, God helps those who help themselves. B, Lord, teach us to pray. C, and Jesus said, whoever lives by the sword has a Second Amendment right to bear the sword.
B,
Lord, teach us to pray.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Luke.
good. Okay, good. All right. Okay, the second...
That was easier than I thought.
Oh, it gets harder.
Oh, no.
All right, the second set, A, B, and C again. A, blessed are the poor in spirit. B, you shall not pass. C, cleanliness is next to godliness.
A.
Yep. Okay.
Matthew
good.
5:3.
Wow. You even got a reference for that. Okay. The last one is just A and B. You have to pick which one it is. Okay. A, love on your neighbor as yourself. B, love your neighbor as yourself.
B.
Yeah, that's right.
But on was in the first title of the earlier book, so, it kind of gets in there.
Just a few last questions in the speed round. This is called, well, actually, I have another one real quick. Lawn ornaments, a fan? No?
No.
No, okay. Okay, so this category is called songs. And they're titles, but they're questions, so I'd like to hear your thoughts. So what becomes of the brokenhearted?
I don't have a good quip for that one. Let's see. Well, they often find love in the future.
Okay, good. What's love got to do with it?
Everything.
Okay. And how do you solve a problem like Maria?
I think you need to be more tolerant than was shown in that movie.
Okay, good. All right, so back to the discussion of the book here.
Thank the Lord.
Yeah. You did well, so well done. So you've done work on characterization of the disciples in the Gospels, and they're often portrayed as those of little faith. They're often terrified, greatly astonished at his teachings. So to have like the disciples who presumably were supposed to follow in their footsteps as they followed in Jesus. faith is a marker of what distinguishes a Christian, and the disciples seem decidedly lacking at many times in faith. So what does this characterization of the disciples teach us about discipleship and that kind of journey of faith?
So this was my dissertation topic, understanding the disciples and their understanding in Matthew, really their characterization, primarily across 16 through 20, where they're with Jesus a whole lot, and also how that functions. So little faith is attributed to the disciples in Matthew 5 times. The word only occurs one other time in the Gospels in Luke, in a parallel passage to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. And it can be defined variously, or the little faith can be described in various ways. It's not really trusting in the power of Jesus to do what Jesus has said and shown he can already shown he can do, and sometimes that they're not understanding. I mean, that they really aren't getting it. And this was a big argument that Matthew had this kind of divide between faith and understanding. And I argued in my dissertation that wasn't the case. And little faith shows in chapter 16 particularly that they just aren't getting it. The nice thing in Matthew is that Matthew nowhere says that these are the ones you are to emulate in terms of faith. The fact is they're called those of little faith, not the lacking faith ones like in Mark exactly, but the ones that have inadequate faith. But Matthew gives us people who have plenty adequate faith. That's not the technical term, but that's kind of what we see in Matthew 8 and 9, when numbers of people come to Jesus for healing, or they bring someone with them to have Jesus heal them, and they have faith, and it goes well for them, or the person they bring. Jesus heals them. And then we have the sort of exceptional faith ones in Matthew, and that's the centurion in chapter 8 and the Canaanite woman in chapter 15, both, by the way, Gentiles. And they're the ones that show great faith. So we have plenty of folks to emulate. I think Matthew wants us to emulate those with good faith, solid faith, or great faith. What's nice about the disciples, though, because, we like them, right? It's not like we don't like the disciples in Matthew or any of the Gospels. We kind of identify with them. What Jesus does is continue to work with them, continue to show himself to them, continue to say, you know what? In the end, I'm going to work with you. I'm going, so in the very end of Matthew, of course, they continue to waver in faith. They doubt.
That was an interesting point. Could you highlight that for a moment? Because I think it's easy to think, well, that's pre-resurrection.
Yeah, right. And there is there's a number of scholars, Kingsbury included, that argue that in Matthew, the disciples improve. They get better. They finally understand. But you get to chapter 28:17, and they both doubt and waver. And that's the same coupling of language we heard in chapter 14. Peter wavers on the water, and then they all worship. I'm saying not doubt and waver. They worship and waver. And Peter has wavered, and then they worship him. So it feels like there's really not much traction toward their understanding of faith.
It's funny. I had to look that verse up because I had it ingrained in my mind that that improvement paradigm of they either improve or just they change post-resurrection, and so that 28:17 was interesting.
Yeah, and it can be translated, they worshipped but they doubted, or they worshipped but some doubted. It's a little Greek construction, hoi de. It's an article plus a little teeny de, which is a conjunction. And it also could be, some have translated, they worship, but others doubted. But there's no others in context in terms of the way the little grammatical thing. I have to tell you. So I had a narrative dissertation, and I wrote it for my thesis advisor, Arland Hultgren, who was thoroughgoing, historical, critical, did source critical stuff, loved redaction critical stuff. Wonderful advisor. But when he would see, I had one footnote that was a text critical note, and I had 2 pages on hoide in Matthew 28:17. Oh my goodness, his Norwegian sensibility. I mean, he got so excited, which for a Norwegian means that he wrote in pencil in teeny print on the side of my manuscript, nice, period. That was his excitement.
Lest you use an exclamation mark.
No, there was no, yeah. It was in teeny print. But I think it's the same group. I argue that it's they worshipped and they doubted, but they doubted. What I love at the end of Matthew, though, is that we're not up a creek without a paddle, because Jesus promises his presence, right? All authority is given to me. Go, take it. Go do mission. Let me know how it goes. He doesn't say that. You know this text way too well, right? He says, go make disciples, and I will be with you. So we don't need the disciples to be people without, with super duper faith. We have Jesus with them at the end of the story. We have Jesus with us. So I think that kind of comfort of Jesus with his followers, even as they left him and deserted him in his hour of need, I think helps the story kind of come to a nice, maybe not a neat bow, but a nice kind of conclusion, and helps us to hear that Jesus can work with us as well.
So you have a section in your book on intertextuality, and that, is looking at how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, which is of real interest to me. So I'm wondering if for our listeners you could outline some of the kind of key moments in the discovery of intertextuality as a thoroughgoing feature of the New Testament and its understanding its significance and how it works.
Absolutely.
And maybe some of the key insights there.
Mm-hmm. I'll be interested to hear, as an Old Testament person, what you consider, think of this. But Richard Hayes did early work on, and his was in the letters of Paul, but he looked at echoes of Scripture in the letters of Paul. Certainly, scholars recognized citations and allusions as important. Many scholars early on thought that the New Testament writers were using them somewhat out of context and a little bit loosely. And that still is a common enough perspective today. Richard Hayes came in and said, even in the echoes, there is often a whole story being evoked or a whole text. I mean, that backstory can be very important for what the author is doing. And sometimes he didn't always attribute it to authorial intention, but the idea was that this whole text in the Old Testament could be potentially applicable here. And since that, Richard's work, it's taken on more and more of a storied focus, I'd say, in many writers. I do that myself in my own work on metalepsis, and which is that idea of taking an echo, seeing an echo evoke a whole context. I think it's helpful to pay attention to the fact that the early readers of Scripture of the New Testament were not readers, they were listeners. So they were hearing text, and they heard Old Testament text, and the way of connecting that with their own hearing is a bit different than reading. So I think they were picking up on storied connections potentially. Matthew 2:15 is often the go-to for Matthew's proof texting of the Old Testament. Out of Egypt I called my son. Well, but that's about in Hosea 11, right? That's about God calling Israel out of Egypt. Exactly. That's what Matthew actually wants us to hear. Because now, just like that son came out of Egypt, God is going to call this son out of Egypt. And so you get this Israel Christology being emphasized. And so often what gets emphasized, or I think what the New Testament writers, gospel writers particularly are doing, is to look at who Jesus is and show those connections to the Old Testament. We used to call it in the old days typology. That's kind of a passé term. People don't like that term so much anymore. I think it's actually a pretty good term to keep on using. Figural exegesis is very similar to, in some ways, to typology. This idea that as the priest was this figure of mediation in the Old Testament, now Jesus in Hebrews, that priest. And so Israel, son, Jesus, son, prophet, king, all those categories are ripe for use by the New Testament writers and idealization. The ideal king, the ideal prophet, the one who comes that's certainly no less than a prophet, but is more than a prophet. So I think those storied connections can really help us hear beyond just little snippets of text.
Yeah, and that resonates with what I see going on already within the Old Testament. So not just across from Old to New, but within, the way that Exodus might evoke something from Genesis. It seems to assume the broader context of the thing it's echoing and not just that immediate word or that immediate text that it might be alluding to. So assuming a broader storied world seems to, if that's happening in the New Testament, be a continuation of what's already happening in the Old Testament. So toward the end of your book, you have a section on narrative approaches to the Gospels and theology. So how does a narrative approach to the Bible help us theologically?
So I've already mentioned, this idea of moving, not tossing aside propositional theology, but moving beyond it when we need to for narrative. So seeing theology as providing us with more than just statements about God, but sort of a whole kind of storied way of understanding theology. So I gave you the example of Matthew's wisdom Christology. In chapter 9, the last kind of big chapter, I take on the characterization of God in Mark. So how do we understand who God is in Mark's gospel? Presumably, God speaks and acts, so can be treated from a narrative critical perspective like a character. Now, I want to assure you that I think there's reality there, that God is real and exists outside of a book. but how is Mark shaping that characterization? How does God act? So God splits the heavens in chapter 1 of Matthew, and the Spirit comes, the schizo language that's Matthew and Mark tend to, they just have open, they kind of make it a little less, so, because I don't know if they know what Mark is doing precisely, but of course, at the end of the gospel, the temple curtain rips in two. It's schizo, it rips again. So God is doing this. That was an
interesting connection.
Yeah, God is doing this, and it's the only time schizo occurs in Mark, so it seems important. So God acts in interesting ways. God speaks, this is my son, you are my son, sorry, this is my son is Matthew, so I have to quit. That's Matthew. Mark didn't do that. You are my son. So God speaks there and at the Transfiguration, but does not have a corresponding third act statement. God is silent at the end of Mark. And I take that from someone I went through my PhD program with, Philip Johnson, who did his dissertation on the characterization of God in Mark. And it's not available in book form, but it's a wonderful piece of work, and I remember sitting in his defense. We could sit in on each other's defenses and listening to his reading of Mark, and it was just compelling. So I'm not going to give away all the answers for chapter 9. I just think you get the book and read it. It's really good. It's one of my favorite chapters, is that set of 8 and 9.
It was very interesting, and I won't follow on with a spoiler then, but I think it is a very insightful chapter. And how would you say a narrative approach to the Gospels can help us pastorally?
As pastors and leaders who get to, I shouldn't say get to choose, depending on how you decide what you're preaching on next Sunday, we might have a lectionary. That's great. A lot of people in our tradition, our Baptist tradition, just choose what they want to preach on. And I try to challenge my students constantly to think bigger than they usually do. There's no holy thing about taking 8 verses and preaching on it and saying, I'm going to stop there. What if you preached on 4 chapters? You could do it. You know that, right? You could preach Romans. I like to take Romans because I've heard this all my life. Well, our pastor's teaching on Romans and we are in chapter 3 and it's been 5 years. I'm like, what? What is so holy about that? What's so wonderful about that? Because we're not seeing a whole picture. I'm just saying, you're not seeing a whole picture. And even if you're not in a gospel, I think you should see the whole picture of Romans. You should see the whole sweep of it. And I tell my students, you need to understand Romans coherently. I'm going to give you a coherent reading of Romans as best as I can, and that's a hard one. And your job is not to take my reading, it's to read it coherently and then help your people understand it coherently. This is about the whole thing. So you should be able to preach a sermon on Romans in 1 week. You should be able to preach a sermon on Romans in 4 weeks. You should be able to preach a sermon on Romans in 16 weeks. And please don't do 3 years. I just don't think it's helpful. I think you lose a whole lot more than you ever gain.
I know.
I get excited about this one.
I was at a church one time visiting. I think it was in Florida, and the pastor had been in Revelation for 7 years. So I think there's something. I guess there's this idea that that's taking it seriously, right? To just camp out and never move on, or to move through, plow through slowly.
Betrays a need to master the text rather than acknowledge sort of the mystery of, I can't nail down Romans. I don't know how to understand exactly 9 through 11 within the whole. I'm trying, and I'm reading Mark Nanos and all those people to help me understand that, But that is the task, and it's an exciting task, and it's not so much 1 verse or 5 verses. And for me, I tell in the preface of the book that though I'd been trained in narrative criticism and started to read Gospels as whole vistas, the whole story, I still kept on assigning students 8 verses for assignments for an exegetical paper, because that's what we've all been trained to do as biblical scholars. And I got really tired of that after a while. I thought, well, this is not helping them. I mean, it's not helping them to go preach a sermon on 2 chapters if I tell them do 8 verses. They give me commentaries. I don't need another commentary. I have a hard time writing them myself. It's not an easy genre. Why are we doing this to students? So I assigned Matthew 21 through 22, which is about 80 to 90 verses in it. And I asked them some narrative questions, and I said, do not write me a commentary. And a woman came up to me and handed it to me back in the days when we handed in papers in class. And she said, well, that was dizzying. And I said, then you did it right. Because you have this forest trees look wide, we got to go in all different angles. And that's the excitement of studying the Bible, is not studying teeny little pieces, but large whole books.
Well, Jeannine, that's a great place to leave us. And I want to say thank you again for taking the time to speak with us this evening and to talk about your book. I encourage you to check out Jeannine's book, which I see there are some copies of up here, The Gospels as Stories. So, Jeannine, thank you so much.
It's been such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.